Ani imamim, ani imamim, ani imamim, b'emunah shleima, hoy b'avias haMoshiach, b'avias haMoshiach ani imamim. Ani imamim, ani imamim, ani imamim, b'emunah shleima, hoy b'avias haMoshiach, b'avias haMoshiach ani imamim, v'afal pi she'yismameach, im kol zer ani imamim, v'afal pi she'yismameach, im kol zer ani imamim. Ani imamim, ani imamim, ani imamim, b'emunah shleima, b'avias haMoshiach, b'avias haMoshiach.
Mayor of Greater Manchester, Mr. Andy Burnham, Deputy Lord Lieutenant Mark Haddlestone, Deputy Lord Lieutenant Mr. Carl Hoston-Bien, ladies and gentlemen, young people, everybody here and online. It is my very great pleasure and indeed honour to welcome you today to this most important and moving event, today's Holocaust Memorial Day service. Today we remember. In the Jewish tradition, remembering is not a passive act, it's an active act. We remember in order to achieve something, to do something. We remember evil in order to commit to doing good. It is appropriate, therefore, that today, as well as commemorating the Holocaust, we also commemorate and remember humankind's failure to learn the lessons of the Holocaust in the years since. So today we remember the Holocaust, remember also the atrocities in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and the ongoing persecution of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar at the moment. Today we remember in order that we commit to bringing good. There is nothing more powerful than hearing the testimony of a Holocaust survivor. In a few moments, we'll be privileged to hear from Mrs. Gisela Feldman. She will share with us her powerful reflections on her experiences and her survival of the Holocaust. But first, I'd like to invite the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Mr. Andy Burnham, to address us.
Thank you, Rabbi Walker. Deputy Lieutenant, Cantor Chait, distinguished guests, everybody who's joined us here today. On behalf of all of Greater Manchester, thank you for being part of this Holocaust Memorial Day service. This is the fourth time that we have marked Holocaust Memorial Day at a Greater Manchester level. And by doing so, I think we send a very powerful joint message from our 10 districts out to the wider world that this is a place where hate, prejudice will never flourish. I'd like to thank all of the speakers for taking part today and everybody watching who's set time aside to be with us, to share in this moment of reflection. And I'd particularly like to thank the Association of Jewish Refugees, who once again have done so much to bring this service together and have provided invaluable support to our team here at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. As Mayor, this service is hugely important to me, and I wanted to institute it when I took office. We must always commemorate the Holocaust, and we must make it a time of shared reflection and contemplation. Give everybody time and space as we seek to learn the lessons of the past and apply them to the lives that we're living now. Think how they can inform our lives and make everyone's life better, safer. A future for all in which security is our common bond and a mutual respect is amongst us. We often hear people say how we must never forget the atrocities of the Holocaust, but we need to do more than never forget. We do need to apply what we learn to now. There have, of course, been atrocities since then, as Rabbi Walker just said, in places such as Cambodia, Rwanda, in Bosnia, Srebrenica, and Darfur. And of course, we must remember today the ongoing persecution of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. We know that genocide doesn't take place in a vacuum on its own, out of the blue. Instead, it's a steady process that can start with casual, everyday discrimination if it goes unchallenged. That's how racism and hatred can take root. We're aware that more than 75 years after the Holocaust, and on today, the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, sadly anti-Semitism still exists, and it has been on the rise over the last decade, gone to places that we would never have imagined. We are also very aware that here in Greater Manchester, we are proudly the home of the second biggest Jewish community outside of London, one of the biggest in London, a community that contributes so much to our lives here, and yet members of that community still live in fear. Their schools and synagogues require strict security. Nobody who lives here can be comfortable with that fact. We've also seen other forms of hate on the rise over the last decade. Islamophobia too. Hate of all kinds, in fact. And we are conscious on this Holocaust Memorial Day 2022 that we are approaching the 5th anniversary of the biggest act of hate that this city has ever seen, with devastating consequences for all of those families affected and the survivors. We also remember the very recent attack at the Beth Israel Synagogue in Texas, which sadly had links to our part of the world, the northwest of England, as well as the vile abuse that interrupted the Sabbath service at the Manchester Reform Synagogue in October last year. Still fresh in our minds, as well as those appalling tragedies, atrocities in Pittsburgh, Copenhagen, Halle, and Toulouse. Sadly, the fear that people feel is also the case, as I said, for people of other religions and cultures, including Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus. Each and every one of us has a right to believe that our children will be safe in their schools, that we will all be safe when going to worship, and it is the responsibility of us all to ensure this is so, and that we do never stand by, and in the words of Pastor Niemoller, always be prepared to call out acts of hatred and discrimination against our fellow citizens. Rabbi Walker has mentioned the honour that we will shortly have in hearing from Holocaust survivor Gisela Feldman. And we have at this service before heard those testimonies from Holocaust survivors. I was just sharing with Cantor Chay, there isn't a more life-affirming thing actually to hear from them and what they've been through, and the inspiration we can take for how we go on to live our own lives. It is a genuine privilege, and I hope everyone who is watching today will make the most of it. We were genuinely proud and privileged to hear her testimony, as it will help us to understand the experiences of those who've lived through such an unimaginable atrocity, and it should renew our resolve to tackle the discrimination and prejudice that still exists, as I said, and light a fire under all of us as we come away from this service today to do the work that will create a better, safer future for everybody. I'm also really pleased that we will hear shortly from Jennifer Wong and from Ismail Malik from Failinge Park High School in Rochdale. Jennifer and Ismail, you're so welcome today here at the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and we are so proud to have our next generation in Greater Manchester with us on this occasion. Their Holocaust education ambassadors at the school do a tremendously important job of not only educating young people about the Holocaust and other genocides, but of also helping them to become more independent, critical thinkers. Through this education, they are learning the confidence and the vocabulary to challenge those who push hateful and divisive extremism and views. So, now more than ever, as we come through the trauma of the last couple of years, I think on this Holocaust Memorial Day, we do need to resolve to stand together, to recover together, to prevent division, tackle hate, and to stop the spread of any form of identity-based hostility. This service is a reminder of our collective duty to challenge hatred or face the consequences of our collective silence, because to turn the other way makes us complicit. By coming together to mark Holocaust Memorial Day at the Greater Manchester level, we can send the loudest of messages that Greater Manchester rejects hate in all of its forms. Indeed, I'll go further and say we are sending that message, that Greater Manchester, just as it has done in the past, is today sending that clear, unequivocal message to the wider world. We are a diverse and welcoming city region, and we are proud to be so, where we celebrate our differences, but everyone is free to be who they want to be, to love who they want to love. We are stronger together, and we will never let hate divide us.
The enormity of the Holocaust can often make it very, very hard to, if you will, find a way in, to find a way of contemplating the messages, contemplating the meanings. One of the most useful devices that we have is the idea of a theme. Every year, Holocaust Memorial Day has a theme, has one small aspect that we focus on. The theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is one day. Two enigmatic words that could really mean almost anything, which I think is the idea. It's an invitation to contemplate, to think, to arrive at our own meaning. With your permission, however, I'd like to share with you my small reflections on this theme of one day. We will be, as the Mayor mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, we will be privileged to hear from a survivor today. That has been the case with every service here in Greater Manchester. But it is quite rare, because many survivors are aging, if I may say. Sadly, many survivors are no longer with us. Finding a way to hold on to the messages and the story of the Holocaust is becoming increasingly difficult. A particularly effective way is the recording of oral testimonies, indeed the compilation of those testimonies into books by survivors. I think it's the right place to say how grateful we all are for the courage, for the strength of survivors in sharing with us. Often those stories are placed in, if you will, a bit of a framework. And usually there's a little bit of a contrast, or a large contrast, between before and after. Between before the one day and after the one day. Between lives of happiness and the normal challenges that we all face, to lives of living hell. At the moment of one day when the sun sets at noonday, when darkness descends, when evil descends, there's always one day. For some survivors, it can even be pinpointed. For those not in Germany itself, it may be the day when the German army marched into their town, city, or village. There may be a moment they can identify in retrospect when the horrors began. And that's useful, I think it's fair to say. It allows us to understand, to frame, to get historical meaning. But if we're going to be honest, as the mayor alluded, it's not really accurate. There isn't one day. There isn't a moment when suddenly evil bursts onto the world. There is in terms of human experience. But in terms of the wider story, evil has to be built up to. The evils of Nazism took a very, very long time to build up. From when Nazism began as a tiny political movement until it became the world-devastating monstrosity that it became, was decades. And of course, the story doesn't begin with Nazism. The rich soil of hate, should we say, that Nazism embedded itself into was a millennia of anti-Semitism and intolerance in Europe and elsewhere. Evil has to be built up to. It doesn't just happen. The Nazis dripped the poison of their ideology into a society through acts of dehumanization, through acts of prejudice. They slowly turned a whole society into a society full of hate for a minority, the majority of whom were Jews, and many others as well. When we remember the Holocaust, we remember not just the one day, the moment when it turned into the Holocaust, but we remember the build-up as well. I made reference to Jewish tradition before. If you allow me, I will again. In Judaism, we believe that good is always stronger than evil. Otherwise, there's no hope for this world. If evil can prevail, as it did, then good can most definitely prevail. But good works in the same way. It slowly builds. As the mayor mentioned, it's refusing to tolerate discrimination, hatred, unkindness, unholiness. And it's to be positively good and loving and caring. I always look towards the front row at these events where inevitably we have representatives of schools, young people, whom we will hear from soon. If you weren't here, it almost wouldn't be worth doing this. Because through you, we speak to all young people in Greater Manchester. We speak to all the next generation, to the people of hope. And we ask you to make sure that this world becomes a holy and good place by taking gentle steps, by being good people, you and your fellows. As evil spreads, so does good. As the Nazis succeeded in dropping evil into a society, we can drop good and kindness. And then we can become a society that we will rightfully be very, very proud of. Today we remember, today we commit to doing good, to spreading good, and ensuring that goodness will always prevail. Thank you.
Well, I was born in Berlin in Germany in 1923 into a fairly religious Jewish family. My parents had a grocery store in which they both worked, and I had one younger sister, Sonia. She was born nearly 3 years later. At the beginning, of course, for the first 10 years of my life, things were completely normal. We had a lovely time with family, celebrating Jewish holidays together, school friends, and kids in the street we played with because we lived in an un-Jewish area. And in those days at school, always friends, religion never came up at all. So for the first 10 years, my life was very, very normal. And it's only some of the dates in future that, of course, have ruined my life and I'll never forget. And the main thing I'm remembering are the important dates in my life. And the first date that comes to mind is May Day, 1st of May 1933. It was a custom for the workers to march through the streets on the 1st of May. And it was always a jolly occasion. People were dancing and singing. And of course, the workers were communists, but they were marching on the 1st of May. It was a holiday to show the freedom workers had. But of course, by that time, Hitler had got into power, and it was the 1st of May that the brown shirts were marching on one side of the street and the workers on the other side of the street. And on that 1st of May, carnage began. The first thing I remembered is that they were shouting and fighting each other, but then I heard a shot and saw a body being carried out of my block of flats. And as a 10-year-old, I felt at that particular moment that life would never be the same again, and I was right. But at the beginning, people were still not afraid, really. I know we had a brown shirt standing outside our shop. The shop was daubed, "Don't buy from Jews." But as I say, at the beginning, people still came and didn't pay any attention to that. In fact, we had a baker across the road, and some brown shirts daubed his shop to say "Friends of the Jews," and they poured buckets of water on them from the balcony. So it just goes to show people didn't think to take that very seriously at the time. But as anti-Semitism grew, they began to be afraid for themselves and did shy away from us. Wholesalers stopped delivering to Jewish shops. The kids in the street we'd always played with and gone to each other's birthday party suddenly stopped, and we wondered what we had done. At school, the teacher that Gisela is still the same, but things did you began to feel there were people against you. So at the beginning, as I say, a lot of people felt this madness could not go on in a civilized cultural society, but how wrong they were. So as Jews started to leave Germany, it was easier for the rich and the poor than the middle classes, because at the beginning the rich could still take their money out and start a new life. The poor really had nothing to lose, but the middle classes somehow felt that they could not give up their secure life for the unknown. So we were stuck still. After that, the next date in my mind is October the 28th, 1938. I was 15 then, and at the early hours of the morning, there was a knock at the door. 2 men stood outside, telling my father to get dressed and take his passport. My sister started screaming, "Don't take my daddy, don't take my daddy." And my mother, who was shocked, who couldn't speak at all, was told if she didn't stop her shouting, she would be taken as well. Now, I don't know what made me do it. As they were watching my father, I disappeared into the kitchen and made sandwiches. And also got out of the flat to a phone box to warn my uncles, but a strange voice answered the phone, so I realized by that time I was too late. So, as I say, my father had a Polish passport, and the Polish government had announced sometime earlier that any Poles that hadn't been back to Poland for the last few years would lose their nationality. And of course the Germans were afraid of being left with thousands of stateless people and decided to deport them suddenly. They finally got over the border into Poland. And I think on that long journey, my sandwiches might have come useful to my father. And my father and his brother still had family in Poland, so they went back to their birth town and stayed with the family in Poland. Next night, the next notable date is Kristallnacht, the night of the broken glass, which was the 9th to the 10th of November 1938. Since we lived in an un-Jewish area, it didn't affect it all as much, because by that time my father had given up his shop anyway, because he was also beaten up a few times. And but the next morning, when we heard about it on the radio, I went to see if my aunts were okay, and I was certainly walking in broken glass. They destroyed synagogues, they destroyed even Jewish hospitals, shops, anything that had a Jewish owner, and they destroyed actually my synagogue. And the son of my rabbi finally became the chief rabbi of England, Jakubowicz. And so when that had happened, my mother decided it really was time to make a move to try and get out somewhere. Also, 30,000 Jews were sent into concentration camp at that time. So my mother was desperate to find a way out, because by that time a lot of countries had shut their borders because we weren't allowed to take money out anymore, just 10 marks each person. And we would be a burden then. But of course, having my father in another country and finding it hard to get a visa was a difficult situation. But then she heard that the Cuban embassy was selling visas, and she found enough dollars to pay for them. And she got 4 visas, because my father would have been allowed back with a visa to go through Germany as long as he could prove that he would be leaving fairly quickly again. So she got these 4 visas, and then she had to try and find a passage for us. And then she heard of the St. Louis, which we put into service for that particular journey, actually. So they applied for a transit visa for my father. We were supposed to leave on May the 13th, 1939, but there was one problem. The Poles weren't as efficient as the Germans, and they'd sent the wrong brother back. So my father was still stuck in Poland without the ability to join us. He was on the phone constantly crying, "Don't leave without me, don't take my children away." And you can see what a situation my mother found herself in. And she told him that I must save the girls. So when this situation arose, she managed to get a berth for him on a boat that was leaving 2 weeks later, hoping by that time he will have had his transit visa. So we then, had to make preparations, of course, for a leaving on May the 13th, which was a Saturday. So we had to leave Berlin the night before, which was a Friday night. Coming from a religious family, my family still came to see us off because they knew they would never see us again. And of course that proved right, because we lost, apart from my father, the nearest and dearest, just over 31 members in the Holocaust. So the St. Louis, of course, was a luxury liner. And we youngsters really enjoyed ourselves. There was a swimming pool and all sorts of things going on. But I remember my mother always sitting in the corner, worried about what would happen, having left her husband behind and 2 teenage girls. What would she do with them when we got to Havana? However, the captain was not a member of the Nazi party, and he told the crew to treat us like any other member or passenger and make our journey as pleasant as possible, in which they really did. Apart from the dining room, we also had a room set up for prayers. And on a Friday night and Saturday morning, the captain allowed us to take Hitler's portrait off the wall, which of course had to go back once the prayers had finished. My mother and a lot of other women, my mother had travel candles, which you could unscrew and made into a little parcel. But they lit candles on a Friday night, which made it a really family atmosphere, which was very pleasant. So we we kept wondering what our future would bring for us, of course. And the responsibility of having left my father was on my mother's mind all the time. Well, it got to May the 25th, 1939. Our landing cards were handed out to us. We had our little suitcases packed. We stood on deck waiting to disembark. We began to wonder why the liner hadn't gone right into the harbour, but decided it was such a big liner, perhaps the water wasn't deep enough for us to go out in. And there we stood waiting to disembark. And after a while, things began to get a bit uncomfortable. And then some little boats came with officials, and they came on board and told us there was some problem, and we would be able to land mañana. That's the first Spanish word I learned, tomorrow. But unfortunately, tomorrow never came. Anyway, after a bit, everybody got very worried and didn't know what was going to happen. So then the captain decided to go on land and do some discussions, but he wasn't very successful. Then little boats coming round with families that were already in Havana, but they wanted to greet the new arrivals. And it was mainly husbands that had already tried to get out as early as possible. And I always remember one little boat stopping and shouting to his wife, "Throw my son down, at least I'll have him." But of course she never did. So everything began to feel very sinister, and we were getting very worried. What was wrong? Our passports, our visas. And eventually a committee from America, the Jewish Joint, came to negotiate with the Cuban government, and they offered certain sums of money for each passenger so that we wouldn't be a responsibility on the Cuban government. But that didn't seem to work. They weren't very successful. So eventually we were told, after 7 days, we were told we would have to leave the harbour to make room for another liner that needed to come in, but negotiations were still going to go on. And they could not decide how many dollars were required to allow this human cargo come aboard. Anyway, the captain could have gone straight back to Europe, but he decided that he would sail along the coast of Miami. By that time, we had also formed a committee because a lot of the passengers had been allowed out of concentration camps and had to sign papers that they will never come back to Germany. And so people were afraid of suicides, and they kept going along the corridors to keep a watch on people. But I remember standing on deck and a man running towards me with blood dripping from his wrists, and he jumped into the ocean. But a sailor went in after him, and he was taken to hospital in Havana, but his family could not go and see him. So the committee we had formed sent a telegraph to President Roosevelt asking for his help or some pity, but no reply. The telegram was sent to Mrs. Roosevelt asking her if they would just take the children. No reply. The Canadian government under Mr. Blair was asked how many people they could take. The answer was none is too many. So in those days, you see, people were not keen to take refugees. Back in Germany, the other boat had left with my father on it, but when the captain heard that we were refused admission, he didn't tell the passengers, but took the boat back to Hamburg, and they didn't know that until they arrived back in Germany. We never saw father again after that, no. Next date is June the 7th, 1939. Finally, the St. Louis had to set sail towards Europe. By this time, we were running out of food and water, and some passengers became so desperate that they even considered scuttling the ship. But the captain said, to put our mind at rest, that he would try never to take the boat back to Germany. What he would have done, I don't know. The rumor goes that he would have done some damage outside the coast of England, and we would have had, but I don't know how true that is. But the captain, having extended our journey, gave the refugee committee that had been dealing with us it was our case in Havana, a chance to go to Europe and try to negotiate a landing permit for us. And he managed to get Holland, Belgium, France, and England to agree to take roughly a quarter each of the passengers. My father must have heard about that in Germany, because he sent a telegram to my mother and said, choose England. Well, that absolutely was a pivotal day in our lives, because the people that went to Holland, Belgium, and France were very quickly overrun again, and quite of them lost their lives. Well, my mother also said to me, you learned English at school for 4 years. Stand in line for the British immigration officer. So at 15 there, I stood in line trying to get visas for the 3 of us. Anyway, he was so surprised that I could have a conversation in English with him that he gave me his phone number and said, when you get to London, if you need any help at all, give me a ring. And he did try to help us, but it wasn't very successful. So that is what happened in all these important dates. And the events of a single day can have a profound effect on your life. Hitler coming into power, our immigration on the St. Louis, in between, of course, Kristallnacht and my father being deported, and all these dates are etched in my memory. But once I came to England, life has nearly all good dates in my life. Although when I arrived at 15, I had to go straight into domestic service, which I always felt very proud of, that right from the beginning I was able to earn my own living and was never dependent on anybody. There's all sorts of things happening in between, being an au pair girl and doing dressmaking, all that. The important things, I met my husband, I celebrated my golden wedding before he passed away. I had got a degree at 52 without having ever had any education in England, and had the cheek to end up teaching English to foreign students at Chiswick Polytechnic in London. Then I had grandchildren, great-grandchildren, who are unfortunately all in America. So But since I can use Skype, it makes all the difference, and they know me and won't forget me and call me Granny Gee and unwrap their presents in front of me. So I hope that understanding the events of the past will lead to a future free of hatred and tyranny. Thank you very much for listening to my story.
My name is Jennifer Wong,
And I'm Ismail Malik.
and at our school, Phalange Park High School is committed to Holocaust education. Our schools have worked with the University College of London. We have partnered with UCL to make a beacon school for Holocaust education. Both our teachers and our pupils are committed to ensuring that the Holocaust is never forgotten. And we strive to ensure that it does not happen again. Phalange Park is a multicultural community school. When we learn about the Holocaust, we think about the current climate and how anti-Semitism, racism, and prejudice have not yet been eradicated. Through our learning of the Holocaust, we can help to better understand where prejudice comes from and how it has allowed us to grow. We develop an understanding of where we fit in the world and how we feel and can react to current situations. The Beacon School program empowers us as pupils to want to make a difference in our own communities. Throughout our lessons on the Holocaust, we are introduced to amazing stories of Jewish people, both survivors and victims. It is very important to us and to our teachers that the Jewish experience is the focus of our learning. These stories help us see the personal and human impacts of the Holocaust. We regularly revisit one particular man, Leon Greenman. Leon Greenman was a British survivor of the Holocaust, a survivor whose family was killed by the Nazis and their collaborators. After liberation, Leon very quickly started to share his story. He started by talking to the press and ensuring that his story was not forgotten by others. Leon Greenman also became a champion for human rights at our school. His story inspires us to keep learning and sharing these very important histories in our classes. The work of a beacon school is not just taken by our teachers. The commitment is also taken by pupils like us. We are members of our school's Holocaust Youth Champion program. The Youth Champion program at our school empowers us as young people to take a lead in marking Holocaust Memorial Day. We work with teachers to develop a lesson based on survivor testimonies. We are then given the opportunity to teach a whole lesson to younger year groups as part of their Holocaust Memorial Day event. Whilst giving us a chance to develop as leaders, it also means that we are taking an active part in working towards a safer future for ourselves and our community. We hope by just seeing us teaching, younger pupils will themselves want to take part in the following year. We are seen as role models and are given the unique opportunity to discuss discrimination and hatred. We know we have a great responsibility ahead when we do this, and we take pride in the real differences we believe we are making. The Youth Champion program has grown every year, and past members have continued their work even when they have left our school. They have continued to share the importance of remembering the genocide in their colleges and universities. We join because we are passionate about making a difference and ensuring that the Holocaust is never forgotten and that lessons are learned. As young people, we now need to be the guiding force and ensuring that we can see the real differences that we make.
Failinge Park is also a rights-respecting school. We work with the Robert F. Kennedy Foundation to deliver the Ripples of Hope program. We are taught explicitly about human rights and our responsibilities as citizens. On 10th of December 1948, the Declaration of Human Rights became a milestone moment in history. The Declaration sent out the fundamental human rights to be universally protected. This declaration was created as a response to the atrocities of the Holocaust. Today, I want to share with you the story of a man who very much made a difference and contributed to the declaration. Janus Kojak was a Polish Jewish pioneer of children's rights. He was also a doctor and author of children's books. The rights of the child in the Declaration can very much find their origins in Janus Kojak's work. Born in Poland, Janus Kojak was well known for his dedication to children. He dedicated his life to protecting children and young people who were not able to get help. In 1928, he published his book, A Child's Right to Respect. What he was calling for from the end of the 19th century would eventually become the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. Janus Kojak said, "Children are not the people of tomorrow, they are the people of today. They have a right to be treated by adults with respect, as equals. They should be allowed to grow into whoever they were meant to be. The unknown person inside each of them is a hope for the future." Kojak was a leader of 2 orphanages in Poland, one for Polish Jewish children and the other for Polish Catholic children. The children in Kojak's orphanage were well fed and well clothed. The testimonies of the children who lived in his orphanages describe a great life where they felt respected. The orphanages were run with a democratic philosophy. The children had a parliament, general meetings, and a tribunal, a functioning children's republic. Each new member had to abide by the laws of the home, governed by a children's court. Kojak often found himself at the mercy of this court when he broke one of the rules, like washing up duty. Sentencing was based on fairness, forgiveness, and compassion. Nothing was imposed on them by adults. The goal of this system was to create an atmosphere of respect and also to educate them in democracy and participation. When the Warsaw Ghetto was created, Kojak was forced to move the Jewish orphanage within the ghetto walls. Kojak chose to stay with the children of the ghetto, looking after over 200 Jewish children aged between 7 and 14. Kojak continued to run the orphanage with the same democratic philosophy as he had before the war. Kojak was so loved by the Polish people that arrangements had been made in secret to rescue him and organize an escape route so he would avoid being taken away with the other inhabitants of the ghetto and almost certain death. He would have to leave the children behind though, as only he could be smuggled out. They would have to face whatever dangers lay ahead alone. Janus Kojak refused to leave the children behind from his orphanage, and all were eventually killed by the Nazis and their collaborators during the Holocaust. While he lived and died in a time and in a place where the abuse of human rights was on a colossal scale, Kojak's greatest legacy was perhaps the inspiration he provided for the promotion of children's rights worldwide, through not only his books, speechings, and writing, but also by his personal example. Following the theme for Holocaust Memorial Day of 2022, of One Day, we look to Janus Kojak's example. We can all make examples that can one day have a big impact. Thank you for listening.
Refugee Blues by W.H. Auden. Say this city has 10 million souls. Some are living in mansions, some are living in holes. Yet there's no place for us, my dear. Yet there's no place for us. Once we had a country, and we thought it fair. Look in the atlas and you'll find it there. You cannot go there now, my dear. We cannot go there now. In the village churchyard there grows an old yew. Every spring it blossoms anew. Old passports can't do that, my dear. Old passports can't do that. The consul banged the table and said, if you've got no passport, you're officially dead. But we are still alive, my dear. But we are still alive. Went to a committee. They offered me a chair, asked me politely to return next year. But where shall we go today, my dear? But where shall we go today? Came to a public meeting. The speaker got up and said, if we let them in, they will steal our daily bread. He was talking of you and me, my dear. He was talking of you and me. Thought I heard the thunder rumbling in the sky. It was Hitler over Europe saying, they must die. We were in his mind, my dear. We were in his mind. Saw a poodle in a jacket fastened with a pin. Saw a door opened and a cat let in. But they weren't German Jews, my dear. But they weren't German Jews. Went down to the harbour and stood upon the quay. Saw the fish swimming as if they were free. Only 10 feet away, my dear. Only 10 feet away. Walked through a wood. Saw the birds in the trees. They had no politicians and sang at their ease. They weren't the human race, my dear. They weren't the human race. Dreamt I saw a building with 1,000 floors, 1,000 windows and 1,000 doors. Not one of them was ours, my dear. Not one of them was ours. Stood on a great plain in the falling snow. 10,000 soldiers marched to and fro, looking for you and me, my dear. Looking for you and me.
An excerpt from the Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank. We're much too young to deal with these problems, but they keep thrusting themselves on us until, finally, we're forced to think up a solution. Though most of the time, our solutions crumble when faced with the facts. It's difficult in times like these. Ideals, dreams, and cherished hopes rise within us, only to be crushed by grim reality. It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. It's utterly impossible for me to build a life on a foundation of chaos, suffering, and death. I see the world being slowly transformed into a wilderness. I hear the approaching thunder that one day will destroy us too. I feel the suffering of millions. And yet, when I look up at the sky, I somehow feel that everything will change for the better. That this cruelty too will end. That peace and tranquility will return once more. In the meantime, I must hold on to my ideals. Perhaps the day will come when I'll be able to realize them.
A prayer for Holocaust Memorial Day. Loving God, we come to you with heavy hearts, remembering the 6 million Jewish souls murdered during the Holocaust. In the horrors of that history, when so many groups were targeted because of their identity, and in genocides which followed, we recognize destructive prejudices that drive people apart. Forgive us when we give space to fear and negativity and hatred of others simply because they are different from us. In the light of God, we see everyone as equally precious manifestations of the divine and can know the courage to face the darkness. Through our prayers and actions, help us to stand together with those who are suffering, so that light may banish all darkness, love will prevail over hate, and good will triumph over evil. Amen.
El Mole Rachamim Shoyechen Bamavoyamim Dayan Almonos Va'avi Yesayamim Hametzei Menucha Nechayena Ale Kanefei Hashechina B'malos Kadoshim Uvetahayadim Kazoahavakia Me'ivim Umazahirim Lenishamos Rivavos Alfei Yisrael Shisha Million Anoshim Noshim Betal Shenewegu V'shenishchetu V'nizrevu V'nechnegu V'nigbaru Chayim Bidei hanatzim hatzarim v'yozveihem yemach shemam v'shalacho li'olamo al kedushas Hashem Sha'anu mispalelim li'olo nishamo esom Lochein ba'al harachamim Yastireim b'tzeisei kanavav li'olamim v'yitzro b'tzro ha'achayim ez nishmasam b'ganei Eden بگنه یدن هو من خصام ویا نوخ بشالام المشکوام و نایما آمین.
As we prepare ourselves here for the lighting of candles, I'd like to invite all of those at home to please join us in lighting a candle as well. Lighting a candle, it is so evocative of hope. The candle that the book of Proverbs compares to the soul, the lamp of God. The candles that remind us of all the candles that were snuffed out, the millions of souls who died in the Holocaust and in subsequent genocides. All those scorched by suffering in the Holocaust and those genocides, and the candles that remind us of our duty to light up this world and make it a better place. And those of us who are at home, so please rise. Let us contemplate in silence what we have heard today. Let us commit in silence to goodness. Thank you. Please be seated. We will now hear the Holocaust Memorial Day commitment.
Holocaust shook the foundations of modern civilization. Its unprecedented character and horror will always hold universal meaning.
We believe the Holocaust must have a permanent place in our nation's collective memory. We honour the survivors still with us, and we reaffirm our shared goals of mutual understanding and justice.
We must make sure that future generations understand the causes of the Holocaust and reflect upon its consequences. We vow to remember the victims of Nazi persecution and of all genocides.
We value the sacrifices of those who have risked their lives to protect or rescue victims as a touchstone of the human capacity for good in the face of evil.
We recognise that humanity is still scarred by the belief that race, religion, disability, or sexuality make some people's lives worth less than others. Genocide, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, and discrimination still continue. We have a shared responsibility to fight these evils.
We pledge to strengthen our efforts to promote education and research about the Holocaust and other genocides. We will do our utmost to make sure that the lessons of such events are fully learned.
We will continue to encourage Holocaust remembrance by holding an annual UK Holocaust Memorial Day. We condemn the evils of prejudice, discrimination, and racism. We value a free, respectful, and democratic society.
Never shall I forget. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp that turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of those children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even were I condemned to live as long as God himself. Never.